"You people always think you're in control," he sneered. That was the moment the entire courtroom stopped breathing. Deputy Marshal Derrick Kane, arrogant, decorated, and shielded by years of silence, had no idea who he was speaking to. He thought he was above the law. What he didn't know was that the black woman in the robe, Judge Marietta Vaughn, had waited her whole life for this moment. Not to settle a grudge, but to finally confront the system that destroyed her family, protected abusers, and buried the truth beneath polished badges and redacted files. What started as a routine hearing exploded into a national reckoning of racism, abuse of power, and the hidden rot inside America's justice system. This is the story of a woman who refused to bow, a judge who turned a courtroom into a battlefield, and a system that blinked because it never expected her to fight back. If you believe in stories that expose the truth, inspire courage, and remind us that justice is still worth fighting for, you won't want to miss this. Now, before we dive deeper, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. We share powerful, meaningful stories like this every day. And drop a comment below to let us know where you're watching from. Thank you. And now, let's get back to the story. Do you think you're above the law, Deputy Kane? The question hung in the courtroom like smoke, impossible to ignore, slow to dissipate. The voice that delivered it was clear and composed, but carried the sharpness of a scalpel beneath its surface. Deputy U.S. Marshal Derrick Kane shifted in the witness chair, his lips curling into that smirk he wore like a second badge, mocking, smug, rehearsed. His shoulders squared as if bracing for applause. "With all due respect, Your Honor," he said, voice dripping with condescension, "people like you always think you're in control." The gallery gasped. Not loud, but sharp, like glass cracking under pressure. Somewhere in the back, a woman whispered, "He didn't just say that." But he had, and Judge Marietta Vaughn didn't blink. She stared at him for a long, measured second. 62 years old, dressed in black robes that seemed to absorb the weight of the room, her face framed by silver curls and eyes honed like steel from decades of wielding the gavel in a world that hadn't been built for her. The silence in courtroom 4C was no longer just tension, it was history. Centuries of it. And in that silence, the air itself seemed to recoil from Kane's words. "Let the record reflect the deputy's statement," she said, her voice low but firm as granite. Outside, snow flurried against the federal courthouse windows in downtown Atlanta. Inside, heat radiated from the rows of spectators, reporters, law clerks, officers, and families of past victims. It was standing room only, and no one moved, not even to breathe. Courtroom 4C had seen many trials, but today wasn't just a case. It was a reckoning. Judge Vaughn had known it the moment she stepped into her chambers that morning. A storm was coming. She could feel it in her bones. Not the weather, not politics. Something deeper. Something that had been rotting beneath the marble pillars and legal briefs for far too long. She had seen Deputy Derrick Kane's name on the docket the night before. A familiar name, though she couldn't quite place it then. All she knew was that the man had a trail of complaints behind him. And yet he stood before her today with clean records and polished brass. How? That question had kept her up well past midnight. Now here he was. Broad-shouldered, crew-cut, a face made for press conferences but a heart corrupted by impunity. He didn't even acknowledge the bench when he entered, just nodded at a group of officers in the gallery, like it was a locker room and not a court of law. His arrogance wasn't just confidence, it was a performance. And the audience? The system that had shielded him for years. Vaughn sat straighter. "Proceed with your testimony," she said. The prosecutor, a soft-spoken young man named Ellis Grant, stepped forward. "Deputy Kane, for the record, can you recount the incident involving Tyrese Matthews on the night of November 3rd? Kane's response came easy, smooth. The suspect, he emphasized the word, was acting erratically. He posed a threat to himself and the public. The suspect, Judge Vaughn cut in, was 14 years old. Kane shrugged. Size doesn't equal innocence. There it was again, that tone. Dismissive, disrespectful, dangerous. "Was the suspect armed?" she asked. Eyes narrowed. A pause. "No, ma'am. And yet you deployed your taser, tackled him from behind, and used a level of force that landed him in the ICU? I feared for my safety." "While he was kneeling with his hands raised?" she pressed. Kane didn't answer. Vaughn turned to the bailiff. "Play the video." The lights dimmed. The courtroom stilled. On the screen, grainy footage began. A cold parking lot, headlights from a patrol car. A young black boy, Tyrese, on his knees, arms stretched skyward like a broken monument. He didn't move. Then in the blink of an eye, Kane appeared, rushing from the side. No warning, no command, just violence. Tyrese's body hit the concrete with a sickening thud. In the gallery, someone whimpered. A juror covered their mouth. Another leaned forward, frozen. When the screen went dark, no one spoke. Not at first. Judge Vaughn broke the silence. "Would you like to revise your statement, Deputy?" Kane stared at her, unmoving. His jaw tightened. Then, under his breath, he muttered something that would echo far beyond the walls of courtroom 4C. "You people always think you're in control." The words weren't just insubordinate, they were venom. They didn't just challenge authority, they insulted identity, gender, race, legacy. They challenged her humanity. Judge Vaughn's fingers tightened around her gavel. She didn't flinch. "Excuse me?" she asked. He said it again, louder. "People like you." This time, the courtroom exploded. Shouts, gasps, the sound of people rising to their feet. A deputy in the back reached for their radio. "Silence in my courtroom," Vaughn thundered, and the gavel came down hard. She stared directly at Kane. "Deputy Kane, I will remind you this is a court of law. You will conduct yourself accordingly." But he wasn't done. He leaned forward, voice low, dangerous. "You got lucky wearing that robe, lady. Out there, you're just another one of them." And that's when the entire courtroom changed. Chief Courtroom Officer Celia Moreau, seated near the gallery entrance, moved instinctively. Officers sat up straighter. The air snapped. Judge Vaughn took a slow breath. "Deputy Kane, sit down." He didn't move. "I said sit down, or you will be held in contempt." He grinned. But then after a pause, he sat. Slowly. Like it was his decision. Like he still held the power. But Judge Vaughn saw it for what it was. A bluff. The courtroom might have calmed, but inside her a storm had started. One that wouldn't let her sleep that night. She stayed in chambers after court ended, reviewing every file she could find. She watched the footage again. Not just of Tyrese Matthews, but of Kane's expression as he delivered that line. "You people." That wasn't stress. That wasn't an outburst. That was hate. That was generational, institutional, intentional. By morning, the media was outside, protesters had gathered, the mayor's office had called, the district attorney requested an update. Courtroom 4C was now the epicenter of something far bigger than a use of force hearing. It was no longer just a case, it was a spark. And Judge Vaughn? She was the match. The next morning, Courtroom 4C looked less like a chamber of justice and more like a battlefield. Reporters jostled outside, satellite vans lined the streets like armor, and protesters, on both sides, had formed an uneasy perimeter around the courthouse. Some held signs that read, "Justice for Tyrese." Others carried banners defending law enforcement, eyes sharp with suspicion. Inside, the tension was no longer theoretical, it was chemical. Volatile. Waiting for the spark that would ignite the whole thing. Judge Marietta Vaughn walked into that room not with fear, but with deliberation. Every step was precise, every breath calculated. She could feel the eyes on her, judging, weighing, waiting for her to slip. The courtroom wasn't just watching her now. It was measuring her. And Kane? He was already there. This time he wasn't smirking. But the shift in his demeanor wasn't remorse, it was strategy. His lawyer, Cyrus Wentworth, stood beside him in a crisp slate-gray suit, his silver hair combed into submission, his smile practiced and hollow. Wentworth rose before the proceedings could begin. "Your Honor," he said smoothly, "before we continue, the defense would like to address yesterday's unfortunate disruption." Vaughn nodded once, expression unreadable. "Proceed." Wentworth cleared his throat and held up a sheet of paper, the kind that looks like an apology but sounds like manipulation. "My client regrets the tone of his remarks. However, we believe that any interpretation suggesting racial bias is speculative at best, and such assumptions threaten to prejudice the fairness of these proceedings." Judge Vaughn turned her gaze toward Kane. "Deputy Kane, do you wish to retract your statement?" He didn't hesitate. His voice was steady, firm. "No, Your Honor, I don't." The room gasped, audible, undeniable. Vaughn didn't blink. "Very well," she said, "let's proceed." What followed wasn't a hearing. It was a demolition. With a calm hand, she reached for a thick binder, the personnel record of Deputy Derrick Kane. Not the sanitized version the defense had submitted, but the one assembled through quiet favors, cross-referenced files, and digital footprints the system had tried to bury. She read aloud without emotion, without pause. Internal complaint. March 2017. Use of excessive force during a traffic stop involving a black motorist. No charges filed, case closed in under 72 hours. A murmur. August 2018. Racial profiling during a drug sweep, witness statements uncorroborated, complaint dismissed. The air grew heavy. January 2020. Insubordination during a joint task force operation, disciplinary hearing cancelled. Kane shifted in his seat, still silent. Vaughn closed the file. 36 complaints, she said, her voice quiet but pointed. 12 years, an average of 3 per year. She looked at him now, not through him, but into him. Would you care to explain that record, Deputy? His lawyer jumped in. Your Honor, this is irrelevant. None of these resulted in disciplinary action. This is character assassination, not a legal proceeding. These go to pattern, Vaughn said, voice steely. Objection overruled. Kane said nothing, but his hands clenched on the table. His jaw flexed. The quiet swagger from yesterday had turned into something darker. Panic laced with calculation. Vaughn opened another folder. Read. Sealed. Yesterday, this court received a confidential transcript, she said. Obtained from a whistleblower deposition in an unrelated civil rights case. The document names Deputy Kane as a participant in the destruction of evidence in a separate brutality complaint. Chaos. Reporters fumbled for their phones. The gallery erupted in whispers. Someone swore under their breath. Even the court sketch artist paused mid-stroke. Wentworth was on his feet again. Your Honor, we object in the strongest possible terms. That document has not been authenticated. It will be, Vaughn cut in coldly. An emergency evidentiary hearing is scheduled for this afternoon at 1 p.m. She snapped the folder shut. The sound echoed like a gavel in a cathedral. You may have entered this courtroom as a witness, Deputy Kane, she said, but now you are the subject of a formal investigation. The silence that followed was volcanic. No one moved. No one dared. And then she stood. The moment she left the bench, it was as though gravity had returned to the room. People stirred. Journalists darted for the door. Whispers roared like surf behind her. But Vaughn walked through the chaos like a conductor exiting the stage, calm, composed, the room still burning from her final note. But once the door to her chambers clicked shut, the weight returned, not to her shoulders, to her chest. Because as strong as she looked and was, she knew the storm hadn't passed. It was only now beginning to swirl. She stood by the window, watching the crowd below. Protests, signs, news cameras, fury, hope, fear, and at the center of it all, her. She didn't ask for this, but she wasn't running from it either. She turned back to her desk. There, right in the center, lay a sealed manila envelope. No return address, just her name typed in capital letters, Judge M. Vaughn. She hadn't noticed it when she first returned. Someone had slipped it under her door while she was in court. She stared at it. A long time. Because somewhere deep in her gut, she knew, once she opened it, everything would change. And when she finally did, she was right. Judge Marietta Vaughn sat in her chambers, the sealed manila envelope resting before her like a confession waiting to be heard. The snow outside had begun to fall harder, blanketing downtown Atlanta in a silence that felt more like warning than peace. But inside her office, the storm had already arrived, quiet, heavy, and inevitable. She stared at the envelope without touching it, as if it might vanish if she waited long enough. But she knew better. The moment it had slid beneath her door, a clock had started ticking. She opened it. Her fingers moved slowly, almost reluctantly, but her heart raced ahead. The flap tore back. The documents inside were crisp, cold, and terrifyingly familiar. Police reports. Surveillance photos, copies of internal memos and disciplinary logs. Some were stamped internal use only in faded blue ink. Others bore redacted lines so thick the text beneath might as well have never existed. But even with blacked-out names and blurry photos, the picture was clear. Derrick Kane wasn't just careless with power, he was protected by it. Pages upon pages of misconduct, witness intimidation, evidence suppression, use of force complaints that vanished like smoke, body cam footage that malfunctioned, officers who later transferred, resigned, or went silent. And then, at the bottom, her breath caught. A name, Donovan Vaughn, She stopped cold. Her hand hovered over the document like it might burn her. She hadn't spoken her brother's name aloud in years, hadn't dared let it live outside the locked corners of her memory. But there it was, in faded ink, catalogued like a footnote in someone else's story. Her hand trembled now, not from fear but from rage. She flipped to the next page. It was a supplemental incident report from over 3 decades ago. A robbery arrest. The suspect, Donovan Vaughn, age 17, charged with theft, resisting arrest, and obstruction. It was the case that destroyed her family, the case that shattered her brother's future and buried her mother in shame. The officer who filed the report, Kane, D. Badge number 41927. She stared at the line like it might rewrite itself, but it didn't. Kane had been a rookie then, a patrol officer. The man who had slammed her brother into the snow while she watched from the front door, too young to understand, too old to forget. She remembered that night like it was tattooed on her soul. The snow soaked through Donovan's sweatshirt as he cried out for their mother. Police cars surrounded their lawn like predators, her mother screaming, Donovan bleeding, cuffed, cold, scared. And Kane? He was smiling. She pressed her hand over her mouth, not to silence a scream, but to keep the sob from escaping. He hadn't just insulted her in court. He had helped destroy her family. She pushed back from her desk so fast that her chair slammed into the bookshelf behind her. Her pulse thundered in her ears. Her hands shook as she gathered the documents and slipped them back into the envelope. She crossed the room, opened her safe, and placed the envelope inside. Locked it, then stood motionless. The system had protected Kane, yes, but it had trained her too. And now she would use everything it taught her to bring it down. From the inside, it was well past midnight when she finally left the courthouse. The halls were silent, the corridors ghostly. The lobby lights cast long shadows. She exited through the underground parking garage, where only a few cars remained. Outside, across the plaza, the courthouse steps were still occupied. Brave souls bundled in coats, holding signs, sipping from thermoses. Some of their posters read, "Protect Judge Vaughn." Others were more direct, "Justice for Tyrese." She didn't wave, didn't speak. But the moment she stepped onto the sidewalk, a reporter spotted her. Then another. Flashbulbs exploded. "Judge Vaughn, are you stepping down? Are you pressing charges against Deputy Kane? Is it true there's a conflict of interest involving your family?" She said nothing, because her next words wouldn't be for the press. They would be for the court, for the people, for the man who forgot that the girl he once tried to break had grown up to wear the robe. This wasn't over. This wasn't even the beginning of the end. It was the start of something he never saw coming. By morning, retaliation had already begun. When she arrived at her chambers, her inbox was overflowing. Messages marked urgent stacked one after the other. Legal threats, administrative notices, requests for clarification. Her name was on every headline, most without context. The first email came from the Office of Judicial Conduct, preliminary inquiry into potential misconduct. 2 sentences. No greeting, no grace. The second was worse. It came from the Police Fraternal Union, a formal demand for her immediate suspension pending a full and impartial review of her fitness to preside over cases involving law enforcement officers. And then, just before 8:30 a.m., a plain white envelope was found on her windshield. No stamp, no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, 7 words. "Step down, or we'll come for everything." No signature, no quote-worthy threat, just a promise. She walked it to her private sink, struck a match, and watched it burn. She wasn't going anywhere, but the message was clear. The system wasn't just defending itself anymore. It was coming for her. The headlines told the story the way headlines always do, loudly, incompletely. Judge oversteps authority in explosive hearing. Atlanta courtroom erupts in controversy. Calls mount for Judge Vaughn's resignation. The mayor released a statement calling for calm, civility, and reflection. The governor's office stayed quiet, but closely monitored developments. The Department of Justice issued a vague note about respecting judicial independence. And beneath it all, something more insidious was moving. People stopped meeting her eyes in the hall. Some officers turned away when she passed. A few didn't bother hiding their disdain. And then there were the whispers of closed-door meetings, coordinated smear campaigns, jurors from past cases being quietly contacted. She had rattled the cage. Now they were sharpening their claws, but not everyone had turned. That afternoon, as the sun sank low over the courthouse steps, there was a knock on her chamber door. 3 taps, measured, familiar. She opened it. Detective Aaron Cross stood there. Baltimore PD veteran, respected, quiet, loyal. They had crossed paths many times over the years. Today, he looked different. Not in uniform, no badge, just a man with something heavy on his chest. He didn't wait to be invited in. "They're not going to stop," he said, voice quiet. "I know," Vaughn replied. "No, you don't," he said, stepping closer. "This isn't about Kane anymore. It's about all the people who built the wall around him, and now they think you're trying to tear it down." She didn't argue. "Why are you here?" she asked. He hesitated. "Because," he said finally, "I think it's time someone did something about it." Judge Marietta Vaughn didn't answer right away. She stood still, eyes locked on Detective Aaron Cross, studying him like a chess player studying the board. Outside the tall windows of her chambers, the snow was still falling, muffling the sounds of a city on fire. Inside, only the hum of fluorescent lights and the low rustle of papers filled the air between them. "Why now?" she asked finally. Aaron shifted. "Because I'm tired." "Tired of what?" He exhaled slowly. "Tired of watching them win. Tired of watching decent people get buried while men like Derrick Kane get medals. I've spent years pretending I didn't see it, turning away, playing the game, staying in my lane. I did it to protect my pension, my position, maybe even my sanity." He looked her in the eye. "But now they're trying to erase you, and I can't be silent anymore." Her throat tightened. She hadn't expected an ally. Not now, not from inside the same blue wall that had always stood between her and justice. She stepped back and gestured for him to sit. He remained standing. "There's more," he said. "They're already tearing through your record. Every ruling, every decision you made that didn't favor a cop, they're lining them up, encouraging complaints. I've seen the drafts. Some are already submitted." Vaughn clenched her jaw. "They're building a case before the real case even begins," she muttered. Aaron nodded grimly. "They're reaching out to jurors from your old trials, trying to paint you as anti-police, trying to manufacture a pattern." There was a long pause. Vaughn stared at her desk, at the folders stacked like barricades, at the red envelopes still smoldering in her memory. "Why are you really here?" she asked again, quieter this time. His voice dropped. "Because I know about your brother." Her heart skipped. She met his eyes. "How?" "I've been digging." "You're not the only one," he said. "I always knew something was off about that case. Something didn't sit right. Now I know who helped bury it." He didn't say Kane's name. He didn't have to. "I'm not here as a cop," he continued. "I'm here because I think you're the only person who can blow this whole thing open, and you shouldn't have to do it alone." Vaughn exhaled. And for the first time in days, the fire in her chest didn't feel like it was devouring her from the inside. It felt like fuel. She turned to the window again, watching the swirl of snow turn gold in the streetlight haze. "Good," she said, "because I'm not backing down." The days that followed moved like quicksand, slow on the surface but pulling everything deeper underneath. Judge Vaughn didn't sleep, not properly. She moved through the courthouse like a woman possessed. Her robe was immaculate, her posture razor sharp. Every word she spoke in court was measured, precise, recorded, for a future audience she couldn't see but knew was watching. Every morning, more headlines. Every afternoon, more subpoenas. Every evening, another anonymous note slipped beneath her door, into her car, between the pages of her case briefs. One said, "They're watching your family now." Another, "We know where you live." Still she came to work. Still she stepped into court. Still she held the gavel like a sword. The media hadn't cooled, it had metastasized. One news network began a nightly segment, Bench Breakdown, replaying footage from her courtroom, dissecting her expressions, tone, even the way she paused between sentences. Legal pundits, most of whom had never tried a case, were suddenly experts in judicial temperament. They called her angry, biased, dangerous. They dug up her brother's case. Even though Donovan Vaughn had been posthumously exonerated in a quiet, buried report years later, they asked why she hadn't spoken publicly about it. They asked what else she was hiding. But she didn't break. She didn't even bend. Because the deeper they dug, the more they exposed themselves. This was never about a single trial. This was about a system unraveling in real time, and a woman holding the thread. Late one night, she made a call. She used a burner phone. Cash purchase, untraceable. The number rang twice before a voice picked up on the other end. "Min," said the voice. It was Detective Celia Min, head of courthouse security, off duty now but always alert. They met outside the city at a diner just off I-75, a 24-hour place with bad coffee and better privacy. They sat in a booth by the window, snow drifting quietly outside. Vaughn wore a long coat over casual clothes. Min wore civilian gear, her badge tucked deep in her jacket. No one in the diner gave them a second look. Good. Vaughn slid a manila folder across the table. Min didn't touch it. "You sure about this?" she asked. Vaughn didn't blink. "They're coming either way." Min opened the folder. Page after page. Reports, photos, files. Vaughn had spent nights scanning and annotating, the paper trail Kane thought he'd erased. Min's eyes changed, from suspicion to anger to something else. Recognition. "I saw some of this years ago," she said, "but they said it was noise, that it didn't matter." "It mattered," Vaughn said. "It was the beginning." Min nodded slowly. "You're gonna take this public." Vaughn didn't answer. She didn't have to. Min leaned in. "You know what's gonna happen if this leaks." "I do. They won't just come after you, they'll come after anyone who's ever stood beside you." "I know." Min looked her in the eyes. "Then I'm in." The words were quiet, not dramatic, but they changed everything. Because now Vaughn wasn't alone. They didn't hug, didn't shake hands, didn't toast to it. They just got to work. The next day, subpoenas began arriving, wearing suits, smiling politely, and cracking open doors the system had once locked tight. Witnesses were called, files reopened. Courtroom 4C filled before dawn, reporters outside, protesters chanting, officers watching in tight-lipped silence. And inside, Judge Marietta Vaughn stood behind her bench, robe pressed, gaze steady. She tapped the gavel once, and the room fell silent. "This court is now in session," she said. "We will hear motion to admit newly uncovered evidence relating to systemic misconduct involving Deputy Marshal Derrick Kane and associated officers within the federal enforcement structure." A ripple moved through the courtroom like thunder under glass. Vaughn didn't flinch. This wasn't about one man anymore. It was about the machine that built him, and the woman prepared to dismantle it, brick by brick, in front of the nation. Objection. The word rang out the moment Judge Marietta Vaughn reached for the red evidence folder. Attorney Cyrus Wentworth stood with both hands flat on the defense table, his voice booming like a fire alarm. "Your Honor, this motion goes beyond the scope of this hearing and constitutes character assassination." Judge Vaughn looked up slowly. Her voice, by contrast, was quiet, controlled. "Icy. Counselor," she said, "you will sit down or you will be escorted out." Wentworth froze. For a second, the courtroom itself seemed to shift, its gravity rearranged. This wasn't about Kane's defense anymore. This was about the system, and who it really served when no one was watching. Judge Vaughn opened the red folder. "These documents," she began, her voice even, "outline a pattern of altered reports, missing footage, and suppressed internal complaints involving Deputy Marshal Derrick Kane over a span of more than 20 years. She paused, looked across the gallery. "What we are dealing with," she said, "is not individual misconduct. It is engineered immunity." And with that, she unleashed hell. Page after page was entered into the record. Vaughn didn't grandstand, she didn't perform. She simply read, letting the evidence speak for itself. It was a quiet explosion. A slow, relentless tearing of the veil. Then came the witness. The doors opened and Detective Celia Min stepped into the courtroom. She wasn't in uniform, she didn't need to be. Her posture alone announced authority. The moment she raised her right hand and took the oath, you could feel the room tighten. This wasn't an outsider. This was someone from within, someone the system hadn't expected to speak. "Detective Min," Judge Vaughn began, "please state your role." "I am the head of internal courthouse security," Min said. "I've served in this role for 17 years. Have you had professional interactions with Deputy Marshal Derrick Kane?" "Yes, numerous." "Can you describe the nature of those interactions?" Min didn't blink. "Hostile, intimidating, disrespectful. He has threatened witnesses, verbally assaulted staff, and on one occasion shoved a public defender against the wall after losing a plea negotiation." The courtroom erupted. A woman in the back whispered, "My God." Another stood halfway from her seat before being pulled back by her husband. Wentworth was on his feet again, red-faced and shouting. Baseless accusations, hearsay. Your Honor, this is outrageous. Judge Vaughn turned slowly toward him. Sit down, counselor, she said. You'll have your cross-examination. He sat, hard. She returned her gaze to Min. Were these incidents documented? Yes, I filed reports. And what happened to those reports? They disappeared. A murmur cut through the room like a crack in stone. Disappeared? Vaughn echoed. Yes, ma'am. I initiated an internal investigation. The deletions were traced to an administrative login linked to Deputy Kane's credentials. Now it was silent, the kind of silence that suffocates. Judge Vaughn accepted a manila envelope from Min and handed it to the clerk. Deputy Kane, she said, voice as calm as a razor's edge, would you like to respond? Kane stood. His movements were stiff, measured, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed him. This is a witch hunt, he said, voice raised. You're trying to destroy me because I wouldn't let you control me. Watch your tone, Vaughn warned. You think I'm scared of you? His voice cracked. You wear that robe like it makes you somebody, but outside this courtroom, you're just another one of them. The gallery gasped. It was the same venom as before, but now it wasn't masked in sarcasm. Now it was loud, bare, and naked with hate. Detective Min took a step forward, hand instinctively hovering near her sidearm. Then it happened. A blur, a flash. Kane's hand moved so fast most people only heard it. Crack. The sound of the slap echoed like a gunshot across the chamber. Judge Vaughn's head snapped sideways. A thin line of blood bloomed at the corner of her lip. She didn't fall, she didn't flinch. She straightened, slowly, deliberately, and stared at Kane with the kind of calm that terrifies even the boldest predators. You, she said, her voice soft but chilling, just made the biggest mistake of your life. He blinked, and then she spoke again, this time to the bailiffs. I want him in cuffs, now. The room hesitated. The bailiffs looked at her, then at Kane, then at each other, and for one horrifying moment it was clear. They were afraid. Not of her. Of him. I said do it, she repeated. Kane took a step back. His voice dropped into a growl. You touch me, and you'll regret it. Then, click, a single cuff. A young bailiff had stepped forward, calm, brave, steady. Kane spun, wild-eyed. You don't know who I am. Judge Vaughn stepped down from the bench. She stood directly in front of him, blood still on her lip, spine as straight as ever. No, she said, but after today, everyone will. The courtroom rose to its feet, not by command but by instinct. Derrick Kane, the untouchable deputy, was led out in cuffs. Phones were raised, flashes lit up the gallery, reporters sprinted toward their vans, yelling into phones, texting editors, triggering breaking news alerts across the country. Outside, protesters erupted, some cheering, some chanting, some weeping. Inside, Judge Vaughn walked back to her chambers alone. The applause had started. But so had the war. Behind the heavy oak door of her office, Vaughn stood still. Her hand trembled, not from fear, from restraint. Because what had just happened wasn't just about her. It was about every black woman who had been called aggressive for standing her ground. Every poor defendant who had been crushed under the weight of a system that asked for silence, not truth. Every whistleblower buried under red tape. And every forgotten brother who begged to be believed. She turned toward her desk. There were still folders to review, still motions to file, still battles to fight. But for the first time in a long time, the courtroom had remembered what justice was supposed to look like, and she was wearing the robe. Judge Marietta Vaughn hadn't sat down since the moment she closed the door behind her. The echo of Kane's slap still rang faintly in her ear, not from pain, but from the weight of what it represented. Her lip was bleeding. Her hand still trembled slightly, but her back had never been straighter. A soft knock. 3 even taps on her chamber door. Her clerk entered, eyes wide and pale. Judge, the district attorney is here to see you. She didn't ask which one. She already knew. District Attorney Thomas Granger stepped into the room like a man who had already had 6 phone calls about the morning's chaos before he'd even finished his first cup of coffee. His navy suit was impeccable, his tie conservative, and his eyes calculating. He didn't bother sitting. You made national headlines in under 20 minutes, he said flatly. Good, Vaughn replied. No, not good, he snapped. The footage is everywhere. News sites, social, cable. People aren't seeing the buildup, the context. All they see is a judge getting slapped and ordering an officer cuffed in front of cameras. She folded her arms. And? Granger stepped forward. And the police union is already drafting statements. There are calls for a judicial review. 2 of the mayor's largest donors are pressuring him to ask for your resignation. The governor's office is monitoring the fallout. Her voice was calm. What do they want me to do? Pretend it didn't happen? They want you to step down from the case. Vaughn's laugh was quiet, sharp. Recuse myself? You need to think strategically, he warned. I already did, she said, when I had him cuffed. Granger rubbed his forehead. You think this is about Kane? You embarrassed law enforcement in front of the nation. You think they're just going to let that go? She didn't answer. So he reached into his coat pocket and unfolded a document, sliding it onto her desk. This is a draft statement, he said. You voluntarily withdraw from the case. You frame it as protecting the integrity of the court. You let another judge handle the proceedings. If you sign this, they'll back off. No ethics inquiry, no suspension, no smear campaign. Vaughn didn't move. He softened. Just slightly. I'm not saying you did the wrong thing, he added. I'm saying this system wasn't built for right and wrong. It was built to protect itself. Her gaze lifted slowly. Do you hear yourself right now? He didn't blink. I do. She picked up the statement, read it once, then, without a word, tore it in half. The sound echoed through the chambers like a gavel strike. You really want to go to war with them? He asked quietly. No, she said, standing tall, but I'm not afraid of it either. That night, she didn't go home. Not because she couldn't, but because something deeper had taken root in her gut, a sense that leaving would mean retreat. And she wasn't retreating. She remained in her chambers long after the building had emptied. She didn't check her phone. She didn't scroll headlines. She didn't read the statements being published without her consent or context. She sat with the truth, the kind most people run from. The courthouse was still and cold, lit only by dim emergency lights. The silence was thick, almost reverent. Her desk lamp cast a warm glow over a single envelope, the same manila envelope that had changed everything. She opened it again, page after page of rot, old case files, redacted statements, photos of bruises, suppressed complaints, and then, at the very bottom, another familiar number. Case ID 94DV2237. She froze. Her fingers stopped turning. There, scrawled in faded ink, was the name Donovan Vaughn. And directly below it, Kane, D. Her brother. The case that shattered her family. The one she had tried for decades to forget. The one she had told herself not to revisit, because the truth hurt more than the lie. She read the supplemental report. Kane had filed the photo lineup. He had submitted the incident report that labeled Donovan combative and uncooperative. He had testified to Donovan's aggressive behavior, but Marietta remembered that night like it was yesterday. Donovan hadn't been angry. He'd been terrified, begging, crying, handcuffed in the snow while their mother screamed for answers and their little sister watched from the porch, clutching a stuffed bear. And now it was clear. Kane hadn't just struck her in court. He had helped destroy her family 30 years earlier. She sat back slowly, the papers spread before her like crime scene photographs. Her hand covered her mouth, not to stop herself from speaking, but to stop herself from crying. This wasn't just justice anymore. It was personal. Somewhere outside, a news van drove by. Its antenna rose like a weapon. Protesters still gathered near the steps, wrapped in scarves and conviction. Some called for her to resign. Others held handmade signs that read, "Stay strong, Judge Vaughn." Inside, she stood up, gathered the documents, slid them back into the envelope, and walked them to her personal safe. She turned the dial slowly, locked it shut. She wasn't going to shout. She wasn't going to run. She was going to build a case the system couldn't erase, the kind no one could redact, suppress, or burn. She was going to speak the only language it truly understood: evidence. It was almost midnight when she stepped into the underground garage. Her footsteps echoed. As she reached her car, her eyes caught movement. A black SUV, parked across the street. No lights, no engine, just sitting, watching. She didn't panic. She didn't flinch. She simply walked to her car, drove home, and began preparing for war. By the time the sun rose over downtown Atlanta, Judge Marietta Vaughn's name had already been dissected in every major newsroom across the country. Not her rulings, not her decades of public service, just her name. And her defiance. Her phone rang before 6 a.m., a number she didn't recognize. She let it ring, then another, then another. The news cycle wasn't just spinning, it was devouring. Every cable anchor had an opinion. Every headline had her name. Federal judge sparks chaos in Atlanta courtroom. Bias on the bench? Should Judge Vaughn recuse herself from Kane case? The footage had gone viral. Not the questions, not the evidence, not the years of buried misconduct. Just the moment. The slap. The cuffs. The stare. And the system? It was moving fast. When she entered the courthouse, the atmosphere had shifted again. It wasn't just cold, it was careful. Guards who once nodded now avoided her eyes. A few whispered when they passed. One officer didn't even try to hide the sneer. And then came the silence, the kind that isn't reverent, just rehearsed. The first sign was the envelope left on her desk, plain. White, no return address. Inside, a single line typed in all caps, "Step down or we'll come for everything." No threats of violence, just certainty. The second sign came digitally, a flagged email from the Office of Judicial Conduct. "We are formally reviewing your recent conduct in court. Please prepare a written statement." No greeting, no warmth, just ice. The third sign didn't come in a message. It came in the form of an empty hallway, once filled with allies, now filled with ghosts. She was still standing at the window of her chambers, watching the plaza fill with both supporters and protesters, when the knock came. 3 measured raps. She turned, expecting her clerk. It wasn't. It was Detective Marcus Hale, veteran of the Atlanta Police Department, black, respected, known for being quiet, methodical, and not someone who wasted time. They'd worked on courthouse logistics together for years, exchanging nods more than words. Today was different. He didn't ask to sit, didn't ask to come in. He just stepped inside and shut the door. "They're not going to stop," he said. "I know," Vaughn replied. "No, you don't." He stepped closer. "This isn't about Kane anymore. It's not even about you. This is about the entire institution and the people who built the wall around him." She looked at him steady. "And why are you here, Marcus?" His shoulders dropped. The formality left him. "Because I'm tired too." He paused. "I've watched this system protect men like Kane for years. I've seen good cops leave, bad ones promoted. I kept my head down, kept quiet, tried to retire in peace." He looked her in the eye. "But now they're coming for you, and I can't unsee it anymore." She didn't reply. He stepped closer. "They're tearing into your rulings, trying to paint you as biased, digging into your past, pulling jurors from your old cases, feeding them doubts." Still, she said nothing. Then, softly, he added, "I know about Donovan." Her eyes darkened. "You're not the only one who's been digging," he continued. "I always thought that case was off, and now I know who helped bury it." Her jaw clenched. She didn't look away. He took a breath. "You don't have to fight this alone." She looked at him, longer than before, and for the first time in days, the fire in her chest didn't feel like it was burning her alive. It felt like something else. Fuel. She turned back to the window. Outside, the chaos swirled. Signs, cameras, chants, doubt. She watched it all and whispered, "Good." He blinked. "Why?" "Because I'm not backing down." From that moment forward, something shifted. Not in the public, not yet, but in the strategy. Vaughn began to move differently. Not recklessly. Precisely. She wasn't just building a defense anymore. She was building an offense. She made calls from burner phones, sent messages by hand, met old allies at off-the-grid coffee shops and anonymous diners. She reached out to former clerks, called in quiet favors, contacted a retired federal prosecutor, Daniel Ross, known for being blunt, blacklisted, and completely unafraid. He handed her a file labeled Kane D. Incidental Mentions. She flipped through it in silence. Kane's name popping up again and again across unrelated complaints, closed files, sealed investigations. Never the lead actor, always lurking backstage, controlling the script. Then came the meeting with Valerie Min, not in her uniform, but in a truck stop diner 30 miles outside the city. No lights, no press, just 2 women and a folder. Min flipped through the documents Vaughn had compiled. Her face changed, confusion to anger to stillness. "I saw some of this before," she said. "They told me it was nothing." "It wasn't," Vaughn replied. Min nodded. "You're going to take this public." She didn't respond, didn't need to. "You know what's going to happen," Min said. "We won't just be targets, we'll be liabilities. They'll come for anyone who stands beside you." "I know." Min held her gaze. "Then I'm in." They didn't toast, they didn't hug, they didn't say thank you, they just got to work. The courtroom was full before the sun had even risen. Satellite trucks created a steel perimeter around the building. Protesters stood shoulder to shoulder along the courthouse steps, some in silence, some in prayer, some shouting into megaphones so loud they rattled the glass. Inside, the gallery buzzed with attention so taut it seemed to hum through the walls. Cameras weren't just allowed, they were embedded. National media sat elbow to elbow with local outlets. Even international news stations had sent representatives. They all knew something was about to happen, but they didn't know how far it would go. Judge Marietta Vaughn entered courtroom 4C just after 8 a.m. She walked with the stillness of a woman who had nothing left to prove and nothing left to lose. The moment she took her seat, the room fell into silence, so complete that it felt unnatural, like the world itself was holding its breath. She tapped the gavel once. This court is now in session. She didn't pause, didn't ease in. There were no ceremonial warm-ups. I am entering into the record a motion to admit newly uncovered evidence relating to systemic misconduct involving Deputy Marshal Derrick Kane and associated federal law enforcement personnel over a span of nearly 3 decades. Gasps, scribbling pens, reporters typing furiously, camera lenses zoomed in. But Vaughn wasn't finished. These documents indicate a recurring pattern of suppressed internal complaints, falsified testimony, destroyed evidence, and administrative interference that has, until now, escaped public scrutiny. What we are dealing with is not isolated misconduct, it is an infrastructure of protection. She let that sit. Then she opened the folder and began to dismantle the machine. Her first witness was Detective Valerie Min. No badge, no uniform. Just plain clothes, an absolute presence. She stepped into the witness box and took her oath like she was stepping onto a battlefield. Detective Min, Vaughn said, during your tenure as head of internal courthouse security, did you witness behavior from Deputy Kane inconsistent with standard protocol or ethical conduct? Yes, Min said clearly. Numerous times. Can you elaborate? Verbal threats, intimidation, unlawful searches of court offices. In one instance, he shoved a defense attorney against a wall. The attorney never filed a complaint. Why not? Because he said it wouldn't matter. Vaughn's eyes sharpened. Did you report these incidents? Yes, all of them. And what became of those reports? They disappeared. Another gasp. Min continued. We traced the deletions. They came from an admin account. That account was linked to Kane's credentials. The room erupted. Reporters scrambled to text updates. Legal analysts scribbled so fast their pens tore paper. Kane, seated at the defense table, had gone pale. His attorney, Cyrus Wentworth, jumped to his feet. Objection, Your Honor. This is baseless. It's inflammatory and prejudicial. Judge Vaughn didn't raise her voice. Objection noted and overruled. She turned back to Min. Please continue. Min's tone was cold, controlled, but every word landed like a blow. I found incident logs that were manually altered, witness statements removed from files. One in particular stood out. An individual scheduled to testify against Kane in a civil rights case was reassigned out of state just days before the trial. Do you have documentation? Yes, ma'am, all of it. She passed the file to the clerk. In the gallery, the silence was so thick it felt like fog. Judge Vaughn looked directly at Kane. Then she opened the final folder. Not red, not white. This one was black, sealed. She held it up. This document, she said, was discovered among suppressed files obtained from a whistleblower. It is dated 1994. It is a memo, initialed and time-stamped, authored by then-Officer Derrick Kane. It relates to the arrest of one Donovan Vaughn. A low rumble moved through the courtroom. She didn't look at the gallery. She didn't need to, because now, this wasn't just about Kane. It was about her brother, her family, the truth. She read the memo aloud. Due to the suspect's aggressive demeanor and an absence of a credible alibi, we recommend pursuing full prosecution on all counts. She paused. Let the language hang. Then looked up, straight into Kane's eyes. You didn't just falsify reports, she said. You didn't just lie under oath. You built your career on the conviction of a terrified teenager who was dragged from his front lawn in the middle of the night while I watched from the window. The room didn't breathe. And Kane? He didn't blink, but the sweat at his temple glistened like a confession. Vaughn rose slowly, not to shout, not to declare victory, just to stand. To let them all see the woman they tried to silence. The girl who had once watched her brother's life shatter, now holding the gavel in the same city where it all happened. She didn't smile, she didn't gloat, she stood in the center of a courtroom burning with truth. And the system? It had finally run out of places to hide. By noon, the headlines had changed. Judge Vaughn exposes federal cover-up. New evidence reveals decades of shielded misconduct. Department of Justice monitoring Vaughn proceedings. The White House was asked to comment. They didn't, because there was no safe answer anymore. And Judge Marietta Vaughn? She didn't need to say anything else. The evidence had spoken, loud, unforgettable. The jury deliberated for 5 long hours. Inside the courthouse, time moved differently. Minutes stretching like hours, eyes scanning every flicker of movement, every door creak, every whispered exchange between clerks and bailiffs. Outside, the nation held its breath. Protesters remained on the steps, faces red from the cold, voices hoarse from chanting. Reporters rotated shifts, feeding updates to cameras like lifelines. Commentators speculated, pundits postured. But inside courtroom 4C, no one moved. Not even Judge Marietta Vaughn. She remained in her chambers, calm, steady, but not still. Her mind was working, reliving testimony, cataloging evidence, preparing herself for whatever came next. Not because she doubted the verdict, but because she knew the cost of delivering it. At exactly 3:47 p.m., the knock came. The clerk entered. "They're ready." Vaughn nodded once. She stood, straightened her robe, and walked toward courtroom 4C with the quiet determination of a woman who had spent her life preparing for this exact moment, even if she never knew it. Every bench was full, every aisle tight with bodies. The air was heavy with anticipation, fear, and something new: hope. Deputy Marshal Derrick Kane stood at the defense table, posture stiff, jaw locked. His once cocky expression had vanished. No smirk, no sarcasm, just the blank stare of a man who didn't recognize the world around him anymore. His attorney leaned in to whisper something. Kane didn't respond, didn't nod, didn't move. He was still like a man waiting for someone to save him, someone who wasn't coming. The jury filed in, 12 faces, diverse, uneven, each carrying the weight of truth in their hands. The foreperson, a middle-aged black woman with steady eyes and a trembling hand, stood with the verdict sheet. Judge Vaughn met her gaze. "Has the jury reached a unanimous verdict?" "Yes, Your Honor." "And how do you find the defendant, Deputy Marshal Derrick Kane, on the charges presented before you?" The pause lasted half a heartbeat. "We, the jury, find the defendant guilty on all counts." The words dropped like thunder. There was no cheer, no scream, just silence. And then, the kind of quiet exhale that comes when a wound starts to close. Someone in the back let out a sob. A woman near the aisle bowed her head and whispered, "Thank you, God." A man in the second row clutched his partner's hand with knuckles turning white. But the loudest sound in the room? Kane's silence. He didn't move, didn't blink, didn't process. It was as if his mind had frozen, buffering a reality that didn't compute. For the first time, Derrick Kane looked like a man without control, because for the first time, he wasn't in control. Judge Vaughn turned to the bailiff. "Remand the defendant into custody." No hesitation, no confusion, just click, the sound of cold steel locking around wrists that once operated without consequence. Kane didn't argue. He didn't lash out. He just stood there as the cuffs were secured, a hollow shell of the arrogance that once ruled the room. As the bailiffs led him forward, past the rows of people he once treated like props in his game, he scanned the crowd as if searching for someone, anyone who might intervene. But no one moved, no one spoke. Because the moment had come, and no one could save him now. Judge Vaughn rose from the bench. She didn't offer a speech. She didn't recite a lesson. She simply looked at the space where Kane had stood, now empty. And that emptiness, it said everything. Outside, the doors burst open. The crowd surged. Microphones extended like weapons. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted, "Judge Vaughn, was this a personal victory? Do you believe justice was finally served? What message does this send to law enforcement nationwide?" She said nothing. She didn't need to. The message had already been sent. It was in the verdict, in the silence that followed, in the cuffs that clicked shut on a man once untouchable. Across the country, phones buzzed. Breaking news: federal marshal convicted on all counts. Judge Vaughn uncovers systemic cover-up. Landmark verdict prompts DOJ investigation. The Department of Justice launched an internal review within 48 hours. 3 high-ranking officials resigned. 2 more were subpoenaed. An entire task force was quietly disbanded and reorganized. But the real reckoning? It was just beginning. For Marietta Vaughn, the consequences weren't delivered through memos. They came to her front door. Late-night phone calls from blocked numbers, letters taped to her windshield. Some with curses, others with just her name written in red ink. An SUV parked across her home for hours. When officers arrived, it was gone. She didn't flinch. She didn't run. But she didn't ignore it either. Security protocols changed. She was advised to carry a panic button, vary her routines, avoid public spaces. For the first time in her life, she realized something devastating. Being right did not mean being safe, and yet every morning she showed up. Hair pulled back, robe crisp, eyes focused. Because if she vanished, if she let fear win, then everything she had fought for would fall apart. She didn't need a talk show deal. She didn't need a viral clip. She just needed her bench. And the real victory? It came quietly. In the way people looked at her now. The bailiff who stood straighter. The young public defender who slipped her a folded note, "I'm studying law because of you." The janitor who paused at her door, eyes glassy, and whispered, "My son watched it all. He said you made him believe again." She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She just nodded, because she understood something most never would. Justice doesn't shout. Sometimes it just stands. Bleeding, unbent, unbroken. In the days that followed, headlines multiplied like wildfire. Some called it a reckoning. Others called it a betrayal. Every network had its own version of the truth. Marshall convicted in landmark case, was it political? Thin blue line fractured by federal judge. Vaughn's verdict reverberates nationwide. The footage of the courtroom, of the slap, the stillness, the cuffs, had been clipped, cropped, re-edited, and dissected by everyone from news analysts to YouTube commentators. But none of them knew what came next. Because what came next wasn't loud. It wasn't cameras or confetti or chants in the street. It was a knock on her door at 2 a.m. It was a letter slipped under her windshield that said, "You made a mistake." It was the courthouse stationing 2 federal marshals outside her chambers for her safety. It was the quiet, deliberate violence of an institution defending itself not through court filings, but intimidation. Her home address was leaked online. One night, a black SUV sat across from her porch for nearly 3 hours. When officers arrived, it was gone. She never saw who was inside. She didn't flinch. She didn't speak to the media. But she changed her locks. She changed her route. And she made peace with a truth she never wanted to carry. Being a symbol meant becoming a target. The offers poured in. Exclusive interviews, speaking engagements, memoir deals. One publisher offered her 6 figures before the verdict was even a day old. She turned them all down. Because her story wasn't a brand, it was a duty. The real legacy wasn't measured in views or press hits. It was in the ripple effect no camera could capture. In Baltimore, a school board voted to request officer records before signing new safety contracts. In Chicago, a city council proposed a full audit of federal task force operations. In Richmond, a long-shelved use of force bill was reintroduced with bipartisan support. In courtrooms across the country, judges once treated as rubber stamps were now facing accountability reviews. And in the quiet places where justice had once been a whisper, it started to speak louder. But so did her enemies. They called her a traitor, a disgrace to the bench, a danger to law enforcement. They said she had destroyed public trust. She knew the truth. Public trust had been broken long before her gavel ever struck. She didn't break it. She just refused to pretend it was still whole. Late one evening, after a 14-hour court day, she came home to find another note at her door. No envelope, just a torn piece of lined notebook paper, folded in half. 3 lines. "You saw us. You believed us. Thank you." No name, no signature. She held it for a long moment, then folded it again, gently, and slipped it into the inside pocket of her robe. Not because she needed it for the cameras, because she needed it for the next morning. And the next morning, she showed up, again, because the courtroom hadn't stopped needing her, and the people she stood for, they hadn't disappeared. They were still out there, filing complaints that might vanish, walking into hearings with no lawyers, standing in front of uniforms that didn't see them as human. And for them, she stayed. Not for applause, not for headlines, not to win, but to hold the line until someone else had the strength to stand beside her. The media moved on, as it always does. But the change didn't stop. A young prosecutor changed how she filed her motions. A judge in another state started reviewing cases from 5 years back. A mother told her son to watch the trial, not for the drama, but for the truth. Judge Vaughn never asked to be a symbol. She never wanted a statue. She didn't want a courtroom named after her or a mural painted on City Hall. She just wanted a system that didn't punish people for being scared, for being poor, for being black, for being unheard. And if standing up for that meant standing alone, then she would. Every day, as long as it took. Because justice doesn't always arrive with cheers or fireworks. Sometimes it walks quietly into a courtroom with a bleeding lip, a trembling hand, and a spine that refuses to break. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of someone you love, or something you've lived through, don't let it end here. Share it. Speak about it. Remember it. Because justice still has a place in this world. As long as people like you, keep protecting it. And as long as people like Judge Marietta Vaughn, keep showing up. What we witnessed wasn't just a courtroom drama. It was a moral reckoning. Judge Marietta Vaughn didn't just preside over a trial. She stood against a legacy of silence. She exposed what the world wasn't meant to see. And she reminded us that real justice doesn't always roar. It often whispers, bleeds, and stands tall when it would be easier to fall. This wasn't about vengeance. It was about truth. It was about the kind of courage that doesn't seek credit, only change. And if you felt that too, if you saw something in Judge Vaughn that stirred your own fire, then don't scroll past this moment. Share this story. Talk about it. Let the world know we're still watching. Because justice only moves when we do. And when one woman dares to stand alone, she never truly stands alone.